Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The fog that night was of the peculiar London breed which moves as if it has a mind, stooping to peer through railings and lingering at corners like a conspirator. At 11:30, in Cardigan Street, Belgravia, the lone constable on the beat paused before number 14 and remarked, later, with an oath that he would stand by it on any Bible, that a man inside the drawing-room had two shadows. The blind was drawn to within an inch of the sill, and a strong gassalia within threw the silhouette of a tall figure across its pale square. That was nothing to startle a constable, but from the lower angle, distinct as a second signature, there lay a sharper, narrower outline that moved not quite in tandem, now overlapping, now slipping away, as if the shape of a second man were trying to keep pace without being noticed. For a span of 5 heartbeats, the constable watched those twin shades perform their mute ballet. Then the lamp in the drawing-room flared and fell, a fumbling hand, perhaps, on the tap. The two shadows met as if to embrace. There followed the dull thud of something heavy striking carpet. When the constable rapped the knocker, number 14 did not answer. It took 10 minutes to rouse the servants, who had retired early on account of their master's preference for solitude. The butler, one Sykes, was a sober fellow whose sobriety became indignation when the constable insisted on admission. By the time a groom had fetched a chaise and dashed to the station for a sergeant and for Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard, who happened to be engaged nearby, Sykes, white about the lips and damned to impertinence, had fetched the duplicate key and opened the drawing-room himself. The scene within would have served as a daguerreotype of death and order. The chamber had that strict handsomeness which wealthy men of plain tastes prefer: a turkey carpet, a pair of high-backed chairs, a pianoforte that no one had touched in years, a marble mantel supporting a bronze of Perseus. On the floor near the centre, like a blot fallen upon a ledger, lay Mr. Ambrose Littleton, banker and gentleman, with his head at a dreadful angle, his hands half raised, as if to ward off a blow that had already landed. His eyes were fixed upon the gasolier, whose erratic flame beat itself into exhaustion. There was little blood. The instrument had been blunt and decisive. A poker stood by the grate, perfectly innocent with its faint polish and a smudge of ash upon its ferrule. The French window that gave onto the balcony was fastened from within. The balcony railings opened upon a drop sheer to a basement area guarded by iron spikes. The layer of evening soot upon the marble ledge was unbroken. The door by which the servants and police had entered had been locked. The key was found on the inside in a way that provoked much chin-rubbing. The safe in the corner, new with a patent lock, was closed, and when opened by the trembling butler, proved to contain a careful arrangement of papers and 5 leather sacks of sovereigns untouched. A gold watch lay upon the mantel and chimed midnight while Lestrade bent over the body. Lestrade, a man who wore his competence like a tight collar, took in the room with brisk eye. He listened to Sykes's emphatic story, how his master had dismissed the household after dinner, declaring that he had letters to write, how no visitor had rung thereafter, how, in the last month, Mr. Littleton had received a handful of callers, whom Sykes described as gentlemen of business, with the particular tone a servant uses when business is not of the banking variety. That there had been troubles, Sykes admitted. Some correspondence that had thrown his master into a black humour, a certain man in a long ulster who had installed himself across the way on 2 or 3 nights, smoking and watching the house with a patience that bespoke purpose. But in the matter most pressing, how a murderer could have come and gone, leaving a room fastened as circumspectly as a miser's purse, Sykes could add nothing but a trembling gesture toward the blind. There were 2 shadows, he told Lestrade in a whisper that made the phrase seem an omen. "I swear it on my immortal soul. The lamp throws one shadow. There was another beside it, moving like a friend at one's elbow who would pass for one's own until you turn to face him and find you are alone." "Poetic stuff, that," said Lestrade dryly, though he glanced at the blind with something that was not contempt. He sent a man to examine the privacy of the area beneath the balcony. There was a gate at the end of a narrow brick passage. It was chained and padlocked. No marks of feet lay on the damp flags beyond the area, and none within. The autumn had been dry. What little dust remained on the stair to the area was undisturbed. He returned to the room and observed that Mr. Littleton's right cuff was ink-stained, as if he had snatched a pen in haste. On the escritoire lay a single page, half-finished, the lines close-meshed and crabbed. The signature was absent. A blot had been smeared across the last words, which were on the second. On that little fragment, the night seemed to lean. "Second what?" asked the sergeant, peering. "Second thoughts," grunted a constable with a wit that did not improve the atmosphere. Lestrade said nothing. He looked again at the gasalier, at the little tremor in the flame's tail, at the way the nearest chair had been pushed back, not quite square with the carpet's border. He crouched and pinched a shred of something between thumb and forefinger. It was a fragment of wax, colourless and scarcely larger than a pin's head. By 1 o'clock the doctor had come, a solemn man whose verdict was ready-made, as such verdicts often are. Death had been almost instantaneous from a blow delivered above and behind the left ear. The angle suggested an assailant of nearly equal height, the absence of blood spatter on. The far wall suggested the weapon had not been swung with reckless force. A professional's blow, the doctor said, and then hummed and hawed and softened it to a practised hand, for the word professional in that context raises ghosts of gallows and alleys that respectable men prefer to keep out of their drawing-rooms. There were no footprints, no marks of forced entry, no ink of a visitor's boot on the polished floorboards in the hall. The servants, shaken and pitiable, were nevertheless unanimous in their statements. Their master had dined alone upon a cutlet and claret. He had taken no callers. He had rung at 10:30 for coffee and been in one of his black spells, so silent that Mrs. Groves, the housekeeper, had set the tray down and fled with the certainty that a word would have drawn down a thunderbolt. "Who were these gentlemen of business?" asked Lestrade, pausing at the threshold as the body was borne away. Sykes swallowed. "Insurance, sir. And, if I'm not indiscreet, private gentlemen who take an interest where banks do not. Mr. Littleton had investment matters that had not, as one might say, flowered." "Debtors?" "Creditors, sir," said Sykes, with the faintest touch of satisfaction proper to a servant whose master owed, and not the reverse. "And one gentleman who said he represented a club, the Alabaster, I believe, though the name, to my ears, had a foreign smell." Lestrade made a note. Outside, the fog had crept into the very seams of the street and made the lamps appear as candles seen through tears. The constable, who had first noticed the phenomenon of the shadows, stood by the railings with his helmet in his hands and his mouth set obstinately. "I am not a fanciful man, sir," he told Lestrade, "but I know what I saw. The one shadow, broad-shouldered, that would be the gentleman as was killed, the other narrower. And here's the curious part. It slid against the first as the flame dipped, but there was a lag to it, as if the light that made it were not of the same strength, or were farther off. Like when there are two lamps and one is bad." "Was there another lamp?" Lestrade asked, looking toward the pavement, the railings, the blank facades opposite. "No, sir, not fixed, and no lantern showed in the street." Lestrade's pencil hesitated, then scratched again. He had dealt with locked rooms before, and with servants whose loyalty plated lies in silver. He had even dealt with shadows that told tales truer than men. But there was something here that prickled the nape of the neck, a second silhouette that had no business on a respectable blind, a half-written sentence that stopped where a dead man's heart had stopped. He closed his notebook with a snap. At 1:45 in the morning, a messenger boy was dispatched from Cardigan Street with a note folded small. It went north and west through corridors of fog to a certain lodging in Baker Street where, if the messenger's luck held, a violin might still be heard at unholy hours and a coal scuttle suffer indignity for the sake of chemical inquiry. The boy, who had never read a newspaper that did not begin with sport and end with crime, was not to know that he carried in his pocket a case that would, before it was done, make men speak of shadows with a seriousness ordinarily reserved for ghosts. He merely banged at the door and delivered Lestrade's scrawl, which said, with the crisp brevity of a man who knows when he has been baffled, "If awake, come. If asleep, wake. Cardigan Street. A locked room. A man dead. And, if you will believe it, 2 shadows where there should have been one." I had scarcely put down my pen when the rattle at our bell announced a visitor. Holmes lowered his bow with that abruptness which in him meant attention. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a boy with fog on his cap and a grimy envelope. "From the yard, sir," he muttered, and vanished. Holmes broke the seal. "Lestrade," he said, "a locked room, a dead banker, and, if a harassed man may be believed, 2 shadows." His dressing gown was already about him. "Watson, Cardigan Street cannot wait upon the dawn." Within 10 minutes we were in a hansom, the horse's breath smoking. Holmes reclined with closed eyes, but the quick drumming of his fingers betrayed his activity. "Either the witness saw a trick," he murmured, "or the trick produced exactly what it should, a doubled outline from unequal or ill-timed light." Cardigan Street lay muffled in fog. Lestrade met us at number 14. "I'm glad you are awake, Mr. Holmes. It is an ugly business." "Lead on," said my companion, very well. The drawing-room was decorous and chill. Within it lay the indecorous fact of death. Mr. Ambrose Littleton had been set upon a sofa. A cloth veiled the ruin at his temple. Holmes paused on the threshold, nostrils a little dilated, eyes narrowed, and read the chamber like a scholar confronted with dense marginalia. He moved first to the gaselier and, without touching it, crouched to observe the flame's cone and the smut upon the brass. He crossed to the French window, inspected latch and ledge, peered into the night, and shook his head. From thence to the mantel, the bronze of Perseus, and the regiment of objects. A faint smear on the clock-glass drew a soft "ah," and nothing more. He stooped at the grate, considered the poker, sniffed it for taint, and returned it to its stand. "Your doctor?" he asked. "Gone," said Lestrade. "Instantaneous. A blow from behind and a little to the left. No forced entry, no theft. Servants unimpeachable, so far as one can tell at 3 in the morning." "And the blind that showed your phenomenon?" Lestrade drew it down. Holmes damped the lamp, then raised it, studying the shape his own figure threw upon the pale square. "Our constable reports a second outline that lagged this one," he said. "There is a smear of oil upon the pull cord. Your men have not experimented with lanterns?" "No," said Lestrade. Holmes's gaze travelled to the escritoire. "May I?" At the yardman's nod he sat and bent over a half-written sheet. "At the second," he read. "Second what?" He sniffed the paper, examined the blotter, and lifted the pen. "Cheap iron gall, recent. The ink upon the point is scarcely dry, though the body is cold." He was interrupted between lines. Observe, Watson, the right cuff." He indicated a freckle of blue upon the dead man's shirt. Snatched writing, a sentence that would not wait. He straightened. "Mr. Lestrade, oblige me with 5 minutes in which no one moves and no door is opened." We stood as statues while Holmes inspected the carpet's nap with a lens, traced the square the chair had left when shoved back, and teased from the border a mite of colourless wax which he set upon the nail of his forefinger. He studied the ceiling rose beneath the gaselier, then the angle between chair and desk, and lastly, the key found within. "The key has been turned by a hand not long accustomed to that key," he murmured. "Note the minute bruise on the jamb. A hasty twist from the inside and by one who stood close." "A suicide, then?" I ventured. "Come, Watson," said Holmes, "do you propose that a gentleman felled himself from behind and to the left?" "No, but you help me set the bounds of the puzzle. A man is struck from behind. The door is locked from within. The window is fast. The balcony untenable. And a constable speaks of 2 shadows. Either the assailant remained, which he did not, or he departed by an exit that left no sign, or—" He held up the grain of wax. He brought his own light and left his own sign. He turned to Lestrade. "You have the constable?" The man was fetched and gave his story with sturdy simplicity. Holmes questioned him about the brightness, height, and rhythm of the 2 images. "Lag, you say? A perceptible lag. Thank you. That is invaluable." "And number 17 across the way?" "Furnished rooms," said Lestrade. "Let by the quarter." "Then we shall pay them a call with the dawn. Meanwhile, have the balcony measured, the area gate examined for filings, and the servants kept to their rooms under watch. Watson, you observed the bronze upon the mantel?" "Perseus holds a mirror." "So does our murderer, of a sort." "The second shadow is his mirror image cast by artifice, which he hoped would pass for the caprice of gas. He miscalculated the honesty of a constable's eye." Holmes's smile was not pleasant in that cold room. "We have our first true line," he said. "Let us follow it while it is warm." Holmes lingered over the wax fragment as though it were a jewel, turning it beneath the light. Lestrade, impatient at his silence, muttered something about trifles, but I knew better than to interrupt when Holmes's eyes had taken on that peculiar brightness, which meant that the strands of a problem were weaving themselves together in his mind. He slipped the wax into his pocket-book, then paced across the chamber with long, noiseless strides. His gaze fell again on the escritoire, and he drew out the half-finished page with a tenderness I have only seen him reserve for a violin. "Observe the smudge here, Watson," he said. "The ink is disturbed not by the drying of time, but by contact, the heel of a hand, or perhaps the sleeve of one who leaned too hastily over the writing. Our unfortunate banker was compelled to halt mid-sentence. He was not alone when his pen faltered." Lestrade sniffed. "That proves no more than an intruder in the room. But how did he leave? That is the puzzle." Holmes gave a slight bow. "Precisely. A puzzle, but not a miracle. You have searched the remainder of the house." "Top to bottom," Lestrade assured him. "No window unlatched, no trap unbarred. Unless the man took wings like a crow, he vanished into fog." Holmes tapped his fingers upon the mantel. "A crow, yes, or a shadow. Tell me, what is the nearest building that commands this window?" "The furnished rooms across the way. Number 17. "Excellent. At dawn we shall acquaint ourselves with the tenants. Until then, we are left with impressions of shadows, of wax, of ink smears. I make it a rule never to disdain impressions, for they are the plaster into which the footprints of truth are pressed." I had learned to hear in such utterances the declaration that Holmes had already glimpsed some portion of the solution. He now requested that we be shown the servants. They gathered in the kitchen, pale and anxious, whispering among themselves until Holmes's presence reduced them to uneasy silence. He questioned them one by one with a courtesy that never lapsed into indulgence. The housekeeper declared that her master had suffered moods of late, pacing in silence, brooding over papers he would neither entrust nor explain. The footman admitted that strangers had called, city men with hard eyes and softer voices, one of them foreign. The maid had glimpsed her master more than once, staring fixedly into the street, as though the fog itself bore menace. Holmes listened with head bowed and hands pressed together. When Sykes, the butler, reiterated his tale of the mysterious watcher in the ulster coat, Holmes's eyes glinted. "You saw him clearly?" "Only the once in lamplight, sir." Tall fellow, stooped at the shoulders. He smoked, and his eyes had a restless way, glancing up and down as if for signal. "And he vanished before your master was found dead?" "A week since, sir. Not seen after." Holmes inclined his head and allowed Lestrade to dismiss the trembling staff. When we were alone once more, he said quietly, "You perceive, Watson, that the shadows are multiplying. There is the shadow on the blind, the shadow cast upon Littleton's mind by his creditors, and the shadow of a man who watches without entering. Shadows, my dear fellow, never without substance." Lestrade made a sound halfway between a grunt and a sigh. "You speak in riddles, Holmes. I prefer doors and keys." "You shall have both," Holmes answered, "but you must permit me the key that is not turned in locks of brass." It was nearing 4 o'clock when we at last quitted Cardigan Street. The fog had thinned to a clammy veil, and the gas lamps shone dimly through it like weary stars. Holmes refused the cab that Lestrade offered, and insisted we walk the length of the street. He paused midway to survey number 17, its windows dark save for a faint glow on the upper floor. He stood motionless for several minutes, his head slightly inclined as if listening for a voice too soft for ordinary ears. Then, with an abruptness that startled me, he strode on. At Baker Street he did not sleep. The fire was coaxed into life, the chemical table cluttered with instruments, and the wax fragment laid reverently in a dish. I confess fatigue overcame me, and I dozed in my chair to the accompaniment of his restless pacing. When I woke, the grey of morning was at the curtains, and Holmes, pipe in mouth, was gazing down upon me with a faint smile. "You are refreshed, Watson?" "Excellent." "We shall breakfast en route, for our business lies in Belgravia still. I have no doubt we shall find our phantom of the second shadow among the lodgers opposite." I questioned him, but he would say no more than that the trick of the light upon the blind was no trick of fancy, but of deliberate artifice. "And mark me, Watson," he added, "the fragment of wax and the smudge of ink are the hinges upon which the whole door will turn." We arrived at number 17 shortly after 8. A housekeeper of sour aspect admitted us to a hall lined with doors. Holmes produced his card with a flourish that disarmed suspicion and declared himself an agent of inquiry on behalf of the police. "We must trouble your tenants with a few questions," he said. As she fetched a list of rooms, Holmes's eyes roved with avidity. He halted before a stair that ascended toward the upper story. "This landing commands number 14 across the way." "Yes, sir. From the window there you may see the very blind you speak of." Holmes ascended at once, and I followed with mounting curiosity. The chamber at the front was let to a gentleman who, according to the register, styled himself Mr. Grellan. The blinds were half drawn, and from the sill one had indeed a clear prospect into the Littleton drawing-room opposite. Holmes measured the distance with his gaze, then bent to examine the floor near the window. He touched the boards, raised a finger, smudged with soot, and nodded to himself. Mr. Grellan is abroad?" he asked. "Left 2 days past, sir," said the housekeeper. Holmes' expression hardened. "Indeed. Then we shall make the acquaintance of his chamber more thoroughly. Watson, do you observe the faint
ring upon the floorboards? Here, beneath the window, something stood here, a lamp upon a tripod, perhaps. And here, this little fleck of wax, sister to the one I plucked from the carpet of number 14. We have found our second light, and with it, the author of our second shadow." His words carried a quiet triumph, but his eyes retained their restless gleam. Yet the shadow is only the prologue. The real drama lies in why a banker's life was ended, and why his pen halted upon the words, "the second." Until we can supply that final word, we have but traced the outline. It remains for us to fill the shape. Holmes's discovery in the room at number 17 was enough to impress even Lestrade, who had joined us with reluctant punctuality after receiving Holmes's hastily scribbled note. He stood stiffly upon the landing, peering at the faint soot ring on the floor and the flecks of wax glimmering like pearls against the boards, and for once he did not scoff. Holmes, crouched by the window-sill, traced with a long finger the outline where some heavy tripod had rested. He leaned forward to look across the street toward the blind of number 14, which now hung desolate, and his expression grew distant. "You see, Lestrade, what your constable glimpsed was no phantasm. A second lamp was stationed here and trained upon the blind opposite. A man moving in this chamber would cast a false companion to the shadow of Mr. Littleton. Ingenious, though not ingenious enough." Lestrade pursed his lips. "It is clever, Mr. Holmes, I'll grant. But what does it profit a murderer to throw an extra shadow on a blind? Why go to such trouble?" "That, my dear fellow, is precisely the question we must answer. It is one thing to deceive the eye of a passer-by. It is another to slay a man in a locked chamber. The shadow is a signal, I suspect, a communication disguised as coincidence. We must ask, to whom was it meant to speak?" As he spoke, he examined the sill more closely and found a faint groove, as if something heavy had been dragged away with haste. He drew a deep breath, as a hound does upon catching scent. "Our fugitive Grellan, if that be his true name, has carried away his apparatus, but haste betrays even the nimblest hand. The soot upon the floor, is not from a domestic lamp. It is of a kind I have encountered before in theatrical contraptions, where lamps are fitted with coloured filters and slides." He rose abruptly. "Come, Watson, we must return to number 14. I would examine again the last sentence our banker attempted." We crossed the street with Lestrade muttering of warrants and procedures. Back in the silent drawing-room, Holmes returned at once to the escritoire. He placed the unfinished page under his lens and studied it with minute care. Then, with the gentlest motion, he held it up to the light. I saw then what he had discerned. Beneath the thick blot of ink, a faint indentation betrayed the downward stroke of the pen. He fetched a pencil from his pocket, rubbed it lightly across the sheet, and slowly there emerged the shadow of a word. "The second. Account," Holmes read aloud, his voice low. "There lies our banker's last testament. He was about to confess something concerning another set of figures, hidden perhaps from the official ledgers. That would explain the visits from gentlemen of business and his mood of gloom." Lestrade leaned closer. "Secret books? Embezzlement?" "Or blackmail?" said Holmes curtly. "A banker is rarely struck down for virtue. Consider, a man keeps 2 sets of accounts. In one, he presents a placid surface to his partners. In the other, he conceals debts, obligations, or payments that will not endure the light of day.
Our Mr. Littleton was interrupted at the very moment he sought to commit that fact to paper. I felt a chill pass through me as Holmes replaced the sheet. "Interrupted by whom?" I asked. "That remains," Holmes replied. "The crux of the matter. The assassin struck quickly, with precision, but the locked door and the staged shadow tell me he was not only a killer but an actor. He meant not simply to remove Littleton, but to arrange a tableau that would baffle. The second shadow was part of his play, perhaps to signal to an accomplice that the deed was done." Lestrade frowned. "Then we must learn who lodged at number 17 under the name of Grellan. The register may tell us." "Indeed," said Holmes, "and more than the register. A man who uses a false name leaves traces as surely as a snail leaves slime. Let us question the keeper of the house more thoroughly." We returned once again to number 17, where the landlady met us with arms folded. She had little fondness for her tenant. "Mr. Grellan? Tall, foreign-looking, always late with the rent. Carried odd boxes like a photographer. Paid for his room a month in advance and left sudden 2 days since. Said he had business abroad." Holmes's eyes glimmered. "Did he leave no forwarding address?" "None. Only a card he dropped once from his pocket. I kept it, meaning to ask him. It had the name of a club, the Alabaster." She fished in a drawer and produced a small card, creased and thumb-marked. Holmes took it reverently, studying the embossed letters. "A club," he murmured. "And our butler spoke of a visitor claiming to represent such a place. The chain begins to close." He questioned her further, but little else emerged. Still, he pocketed the card with satisfaction and declared our business done. Lestrade promised to set his men upon tracing the elusive Mr. Grellan. As we walked back through the thinning fog, Holmes' mind was clearly at fever pitch. He spoke half to himself, his words tumbling out in fragments. A second account as the Alabaster Club's creditors turned avengers, and an assassin who plays with shadows as though upon a stage. "Watson, there is drama in this case such as would make a playwright weep with envy." At Baker Street he threw himself into his chair, lit his pipe, and stared at the ceiling. I ventured a question. "Do you believe the club holds the key?" "I believe, Watson," he said gravely, "that we are about to walk into a den where finance and villainy shake hands. Mr. Littleton was ensnared, and when he sought to confess, he was silenced. The shadow was not meant for the constable's eyes, but for another who watched, perhaps even from this very street." He fell into silence, and I dared not disturb him. The case had taken on that peculiar shimmer I had learned to fear, when Holmes scented a quarry not of mere crime, but of conspiracy. The morning light broke grey upon the city, and the fog lifted from the housetops, but still the image haunted me, the shadow of a man upon a blind, doubled by another that should never have been. Holmes did not stir from his chair for the better part of an hour, his gaze fixed upon the smoke, curling upward in delicate spirals. I had grown accustomed to these silences, yet the tension of the case made every tick of the clock echo like a hammer in my ears. At last he rose, flung the pipe aside, and reached for his violin. A few wandering notes filled the sitting-room, mournful at first, then gathering into a quick, decisive march. When he set the instrument down, his expression had hardened into that keen alertness which always preceded decisive action. "Watson," he said, "our banker's shadow stretches far beyond Cardigan Street. The Alabaster Club is the heart of the matter. Have you ever heard of it?" I confessed my ignorance. "It is not one of those institutions that advertise their existence. It caters to a circle where wealth changes hands more rapidly than coin at a gaming table. Foreign financiers, aristocrats of dubious means, and the occasional sharper in gentleman's attire. These are its patrons. Littleton, desperate to cover the deficit in his second account, no doubt turned to such a place for assistance. And when a man borrows from shadows, Watson, he pays in blood. Before I could reply, Lestrade entered, looking both weary and vexed. He had brought reports from the yard. No trace of Grellan at the ports, no luggage under that name, no witnesses who recalled his departure. Holmes took the papers, skimmed them, and smiled faintly. Of course not. A man clever enough to cast shadows upon blinds is clever enough to vanish beneath another name. But I have faith in a trail less obvious. Tell me, Lestrade, did you inquire among the theatrical suppliers of London? Lestrade blinked. Theatrical suppliers? What have they to do with it? Holmes held up the wax fragment between finger and thumb. This, my dear Inspector, is of the sort used in stage lanterns. Coloured glass is fixed with such wax, allowing effects upon scenery. Our murderer adapted the trick to a window. If Grellan is indeed of that trade, or if he merely purchased the equipment, some vendor will recall him. Grumbling, but not dismissing the suggestion, Lestrade promised to dispatch inquiries. When he had gone, Holmes turned to me with sudden energy. We cannot wait for officialdom. The club must be sounded at once before whispers of murder reach its gilded ears. There is only one course. We go as shadows ourselves. By late afternoon, the fog had lifted into a pale haze, and we found ourselves at the threshold of the Alabaster. It stood in a discreet square near St. James's, its door marked only by a polished brass plate. Inside, thick carpets muffled every step, and the air smelled faintly of tobacco and wealth. A liveried porter admitted us with a glance at Holmes's card, and soon we were conducted into a lounge where a dozen men sat in clusters, speaking in low tones over cigars and brandy. Holmes, transformed into the very picture of a languid investor, leaned upon his cane and ordered wine. His manner was one of weary affluence, his eyelids half lowered, his voice indolent. I marvelled, as I had often done, at the completeness of his disguise. He conversed idly with a member about Eastern railways, then drifted toward a table where two men whispered with heads close. I followed at a distance, pretending interest in the portraits upon the wall. One of the men was thick-set, with a scar running from ear to jaw, the other pale and refined, with restless fingers that tapped against his glass. At the mention of Littleton's name, spoken carelessly by Holmes as if in passing, both started. The scarred man recovered quickly, but the pale one glanced about the room with nervous eyes. Holmes noted it without appearing to. "A sad affair," he murmured. "A banker's fall is always tragic for those entangled in his affairs. One wonders what will become of his second ventures." The pale man's glass slipped and shattered on the carpet. His companion muttered something sharp, and both rose, leaving the lounge abruptly. Holmes watched them go, then leaned toward me. "You mark that, Watson? The mere whisper of a second account was enough to unman him. We must know their names." It was not difficult to procure them. A discreet inquiry to the porter revealed that the scarred man was Mr. Crenshaw, formerly of the Guards, now living by his wits, while the pale fellow styled himself Mr. Vanier, a foreign gentleman of uncertain fortune. Both had been frequent visitors in recent weeks, often in company with a third, none other than Grellan. Holmes's eyes shone. "The circle closes. Littleton, burdened by debt, dealt with these men. Grellan provided the stagecraft, Crenshaw the muscle, Vanier the go-between. But what was their object? Robbery? No, the safe was untouched. It was silence they sought, lest Littleton expose their dealings. He wrote the words, 'the second account,' and for that he was struck down. We left the club as evening drew in. the lamps flaring in the mist. Holmes was deep in thought, his steps quickening. Suddenly he halted beneath an archway and turned to me with a fierce intensity. "Watson, do you not see? They feared exposure not merely of debts, but of something greater. A banker's private account may conceal the flow of money destined for purposes darker than speculation." Littleton had stumbled upon a scheme in which the Alabaster Club is but the outer garment. These men are part of it, and Grellan, with his shadows, was their instrument. I shivered at his words, for the night seemed colder than before, yet Holmes's expression was not of fear, but of eagerness. "We are close, Watson, very close. Tomorrow we set the snare. Shadows have deceived us long enough. It is time we turn the lamp upon them." Holmes's declaration that we were near the heart of the mystery haunted me through the night. His eyes had burned with that peculiar brilliance which I knew too well. It meant that the invisible threads were tightening in his grasp. Yet I could not rid myself of a sense of peril. If indeed the Alabaster Club sheltered men capable of such a calculated murder, then we were setting ourselves against adversaries who would not hesitate to strike again. At breakfast, Holmes seemed preoccupied, scarcely touching his food. He spread the card from the club upon the table, turning it over and over between his fingers. At last he spoke. "Watson, you recall the moment when Vanier dropped his glass? It was not the name of Littleton that unnerved him, but the phrase, 'second ventures.' These men dread that word, second, more than the gallows. It points to an account, or perhaps to something more sinister, known to Littleton alone. Our task is to uncover what lay within it, and to do so before Grellan or his companions can efface the trail entirely." "Have you some plan, Holmes?" I asked. He gave me a quick smile. "You know me too well to suppose I would sleep without one. Today we must divide our efforts. Lestrade is already pursuing the theatrical suppliers, and I expect word from him before noon. As for us, we return to the Littleton residence. There are papers in that safe which demand another scrutiny." We set out at once, and the fog of the previous day had thinned into a pale, weak sunshine. The house in Cardigan Street bore the hush of morning. The blinds were drawn, and a crepe hung upon the door. Sikes admitted us with solemn deference, though his eyes betrayed suspicion at our return. Holmes wasted no time with preliminaries, but went straight to the drawing-room, where the safe still stood against the wall. "You told us it contained only papers and sovereigns," Holmes said. "Permit us to examine more closely." Reluctantly, the butler produced the key. Holmes drew out each bundle of documents with meticulous care, spreading them across the table. He passed them one by one beneath my eye, but to me they were a maze of figures and formal contracts, all impenetrable. Holmes, however, sifted them swiftly, pausing only when he came upon a small, leather-bound ledger of unassuming appearance. He opened it, and a gleam of triumph crossed his face. "Ah, Watson, here is our quarry. Observe." The entries are in two hands, the neat, clerkly script of Littleton, and interspersed with it a heavier, less disciplined scrawl. These pages record transactions that never passed through the bank. Here are sums advanced to names we do not know, but I warrant they would lead us directly to the men of the Alabaster Club. And here, this is most suggestive, are payments marked only with a cipher. They recur at regular intervals as if some subscription were being maintained. This is the second account. Before I could reply, Lestrade was announced. He entered with his habitual air of brisk importance, but even his self-assurance faltered when Holmes placed the ledger in his hands. "It ties them together, Lestrade," Holmes said. "The shadow, the club, the murder. Here is the bond. But I trust you have brought me something of equal value from your inquiries." Lestrade's expression softened into a grudging admiration. "You were right, Mr. Holmes. One of my men traced a purchase to a shop in Drury Lane. A dealer in stage properties, a tall fellow, foreign accent, bought a lantern and tripod 3 weeks ago, paid in cash, gave his name as Grellan." Holmes clapped his hands softly. "Excellent! The chain is complete. Now, Lestrade, we must act with delicacy. These men are desperate, and they will move to recover or destroy this ledger once they learn it has escaped them." His words proved prophetic, for scarcely had he replaced the ledger in the safe when there came a sharp knock at the door. Sikes returned, flustered, to announce that 2 gentlemen had called, demanding to see the late Mr. Littleton's papers on urgent business. Holmes exchanged a glance with Lestrade, and in that instant I saw the trap begin to spring in his mind. "Show them into the drawing-room," Holmes directed calmly. "We shall receive them." Moments later, Crenshaw and Vanier entered. The scarred soldier carried himself with a swaggering defiance, while his pale companion's eyes darted nervously about the room. They started upon finding Holmes and Lestrade present, but Crenshaw recovered at once. "This is irregular," he said gruffly. "We came at the invitation of Mr. Littleton, and we will have what belongs to us." Holmes regarded him with cold amusement. "You are somewhat late for your appointment. Mr. Littleton is beyond granting interviews, but perhaps you will tell us what business you had with his second account?" Vanier gave a strangled cry, but Crenshaw silenced him with a gesture. "That is none of your affair. Produce the ledger and we may yet come to terms." Lestrade stepped forward, his hand at his breast pocket. "The only terms are those of the law. You are under suspicion of conspiracy and
Murder. Crenshaw's hand twitched toward his coat, but Holmes's voice cut like steel. "Do not, sir. You will find that shadows are not the only things that can double. The yard is nearer than you think." The men hesitated, then exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Vanier's face had grown ashen, and I saw his lips frame the word "grey" before Crenshaw clamped a hand upon his arm. They turned as if to retreat, but Lestrade's men, whom Holmes had summoned by messenger that morning, were already at the door. The conspirators were seized, struggling, and borne away. When the house was quiet again, Holmes closed the safe with a decisive snap. "So the actors come upon the stage, Watson, each in his turn, yet the play is not complete. Grellan remains at large, and he is the cleverest of them all. Until we have him, the shadow lingers." We left Cardigan Street with the ledger secure in Lestrade's custody, but Holmes's brow was furrowed in thought. As we rode back to Baker Street, he spoke at last. "Mark my words, Watson. Grellan is the key. Those others are but instruments, blunt, clumsy, and driven by greed. But Grellan is the hand that held the lantern, the mind that devised the shadows. He will not let his scheme collapse without a final effort. We must be ready when the second shadow falls again." Holmes's prediction that Grellan would not remain hidden for long proved unnervingly accurate. The very next morning, as we sat at breakfast, Mrs. Hudson brought in a telegram with trembling hands. Holmes tore it open and read aloud in a tone that betrayed both excitement and grim satisfaction. "From Lestrade. Crenshaw and Vanier refused to speak. Grellan sighted near the docks. Escaped pursuit. Believed still in London. Advise immediate counsel." He flung the slip upon the table. "As I said, Watson, the hand behind the lantern still plays its game, and the docks. Ah, that is the place where shadows breed." He wasted no time, but collected his coat and cane with a briskness that admitted no delay. "We go to the riverside," he said. "There is no refuge for a man so distinctive as Grellan among honest workmen, but among the smoke, the warehouses, and the fog, he may hope to vanish like a moth against a lamp." We reached the Thames near Shadwell by mid-morning. The river was alive with barges and small craft. Cranes groaned along the wharves, and the air reeked of tar and wet timber. Holmes guided us through alleys where ragged children played and stevedores lounged against barrels. He moved with the assurance of a man who smelled his quarry, pausing now and then to question a docker or peer into the dim recess of a warehouse. At last, at a public house by the water's edge, we found a clue. A surly landlord admitted that a tall, foreign-looking fellow had taken a room 2 nights past, carrying a trunk of unusual weight. He had left at dawn, paying for the week in advance, and had not been seen since.
Holmes examined the chamber and at once drew my attention to a curious smear upon the window frame. "Wax again, Watson." He experimented here as well, perhaps perfecting his device. "And note this, ashes from coloured paper, burned in the grate. He destroys what may betray him, yet he cannot erase every trace." He straightened suddenly, his eyes alive with keen excitement. "Our man prepares for another performance. Mark my words, he will not leave the stage until he has played his last scene. Come, we must outpace him." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes spent several hours in restless calculation, sketching diagrams of shadows upon blinds, measuring angles with compasses and muttering to himself of distances and lamps. I attempted to draw him into conversation, but he waved me aside with absent courtesy. At last he sprang to his feet. "It is plain now, Watson. Grellan will attempt to retrieve the ledger. Without it, the conspiracy collapses. With it, he holds the power to silence his accomplices and perhaps even to blackmail others into submission. He knows Lestrade has custody of the book, but he also knows Lestrade's men are fallible. Therefore, he will seek to use his artifice once more to deceive their watch. He will cast a shadow where none should be to lure them from their post. When they rush to the wrong window or door, he will slip through the right. Elegant in its simplicity, but deadly in execution." "And how do you propose to stop him?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "By turning his trick against him. We shall provide the shadow he expects, and behind it the trap he cannot escape." That night the plan was set in motion. Lestrade, though sceptical, acceded to Holmes's direction. The ledger was placed in a strong-box and secured within the yard, but word was deliberately allowed to drift into the right ears that it lay hidden instead in a government clerk's chambers near Chancery Lane. A window was left conspicuously unshuttered, a lamp arranged within, so that its glow fell temptingly across the blind. And in the chamber itself, Holmes and I waited in silence, Lestrade and 2 of his men concealed in the adjoining corridor. The hours crawled by. The gas hissed softly. The city outside seemed wrapped in cotton. Midnight struck, and I began to think our vigil fruitless. Then Holmes, crouched at the blind, gave a whisper. "Watson, look." There, upon the pale square of cloth, our shadows lay side by side. Yet a third began to creep across, thin and distinct, lagging a moment behind the movement of Holmes's arm. It was the same phenomenon described by the constable in Cardigan Street. A second shadow had appeared, though no man stood beside us. Holmes's voice was taut with triumph. "He's here. The lantern is trained from without. He believes us duped. Stand fast." The shadow wavered, withdrew, then lengthened again as though its owner tested the deception. Presently there came the faint scrape of metal at the lock of the outer door. Holmes raised his hand, and at once Lestrade and his men burst forth from their hiding-place. A cry rang out, followed by the crash of overturned furniture. I rushed to the threshold in time to see a tall figure struggling like a trapped animal, his lantern still clutched in one hand. The constables bore him down, and Holmes himself wrenched the contraption from his grasp. At last we had our quarry. Greffin, his ulster torn, his eyes blazing with furious defiance. Even in defeat he retained a certain sinister dignity, as though the play were not yet finished. Holmes regarded him with cold composure. "Your shadows have betrayed you, sir. It is fitting that you, who lived by false silhouettes, should be undone by your own trick." Grellan spat an oath in a tongue I did not know, but his struggle ceased. He was led away under heavy guard, and the lantern with its waxed fittings and coloured glass lay broken upon the floor. Holmes examined it briefly, then turned to me with a quiet satisfaction. "So ends the career of the second shadow, Watson. Yet I fear the ledger will reveal that his masters were more numerous than we have yet grasped. This is no solitary villain, but part of a network where finance, fraud, and force walk hand in hand. Tonight we have captured the actor, but the play, I think, has more acts yet to run." I could not help but shudder, for though Grellan was in chains, the darkness seemed not dispelled, but deepened. And Holmes, with his eyes shining and his face grave, looked every inch the solitary sentinel against the encroaching night. Grellan's capture brought no sense of conclusion, but rather the uncanny stillness that follows the striking of a clock before its chime has faded. He was lodged in a cell under Lestrade's guard, and the contrivance of his lantern was carried to Baker Street, where Holmes laid it out upon the table like a dissected specimen. I watched as he examined every fragment, the glass plates, the wax fixings, the brass casings scorched by long use. He traced with a fingertip the grooves where coloured filters had been slipped, and his expression grew thoughtful rather than triumphant. "You observe, Watson," he said, "the ingenuity of the man. This is not a common lantern, but a modified projector capable of casting an image with precision. He might have used it for photographic slides, but he chose instead to double a man's outline. The second shadow was not a flourish, but a calculated signal. It told an accomplice, watching from a distance, that the work within was complete." "And yet," I ventured, "with Grellan in custody, the scheme is broken." Holmes' eyes darkened. "Broken at its edge, perhaps, but not at its heart. Crenshaw and Vanier may be silenced by fear. Grellan will wrap himself in foreign silence. But the ledger, Watson, that is the true voice of the conspiracy. We must hear it before others contrive to muffle it." That evening Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, pale and irritable. He reported that Grellan had maintained an obstinate silence through hours of questioning. He denied nothing, confessed nothing, and laughed when pressed. "We have him on attempt and on instrument," Lestrade declared. "But without clearer evidence of the banker's death, the law will call it circumstantial." Holmes accepted this grim news with a nod. "Then we must provide the law its clarity. I have spent the afternoon with the ledger, and its pages reveal more than numbers. Look here." He spread the book before us, his long finger resting on a series of ciphers. "Observe how the payments marked by symbols recur at intervals of 3 weeks. Trace them forward, and you arrive at a date which falls tomorrow. The next instalment was due, and with Littleton dead, its collectors will grow anxious. They may even risk a meeting to discuss the loss. If we can be present in whatever guise, we shall grasp the shape of the net that ensnared him." Lestrade was dubious, but Holmes pressed his point with characteristic force. At length the inspector agreed to furnish 2 plainclothes men and to await Holmes's signal should the occasion arise. The following night, under Holmes' careful guidance, we positioned ourselves near a narrow passage off Pall Mall. The address had been scrawled in the ledger beside the ciphered payments, B House 10. It proved to be a discreet townhouse, its shutters closed, its knocker unused. A faint glow at the upper windows betrayed occupation. Holmes, cloaked in his long coat and muffled to the chin, led us into the shadow of a doorway opposite. There we waited, silent as statues, until the slow approach of footsteps upon the pavement broke the stillness. A carriage drew up. From it descended two figures, their features obscured by collars and hats. One I recognized at once as Crenshaw, released on bail and moving with the bold swagger of a man who believes himself untouchable. The other was Vanier, his pale face drawn with anxiety. They glanced about, then vanished into the house. Holmes's hand touched my arm. Now we shall see the puppeteers at their work. Within minutes, another arrival came, a sleek gentleman in evening dress, whose presence carried an air of higher circles. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Note him well, Watson. That is no mere sharper. He walks with the assurance of one accustomed to command. I should not wonder if his name adorns the very institutions that deplore such clubs in public while patronizing them in private." Holmes's instinct proved correct, for when the door closed behind the man, faint voices drifted to us through the night air. We could not distinguish words, but the tones betrayed both argument and command. Then came a louder exchange, Vanier's high voice quivering with fear, Crenshaw's blunt retort, and finally the silken authority of the newcomer stilling them both. Holmes pressed closer to the shutters of the house, producing a small mirror from his pocket, with which he contrived to catch a glimpse through a gap. After a tense moment he withdrew, his expression grave. "There are 4 within, Watson. Our 3 known actors, and a 4th, older, with silver hair." I recognized him. He is Sir Reginald Colburn, a financier of repute, seated upon boards of several banks. He is the hand behind the hand, the patron whose respectability shields the rogues. Littleton discovered his name in the second account, and for that he was silenced. The shadow play was but the curtain to conceal the true drama. Before I could reply, the door of the house opened, and a servant slipped out, carrying a satchel. He hurried off toward the Strand. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "The next payment, sent to ground before suspicion falls. We must act now, before evidence is scattered." He gave a sharp whistle, and Lestrade's men, waiting in the street's recesses, converged. The door was forced in a rush, and cries of alarm echoed through the hall. I followed Holmes into a richly furnished chamber, where the conspirators had been seated. Papers lay upon the table, lists of names, amounts, and symbols matching those of the ledger. Crenshaw leapt up with an oath, Vanier cowered, and Sir Reginald rose with icy composure. Lestrade stormed in behind us, exultant. "We have you now. Documents, witnesses, and the man who cast your shadows." For a moment it seemed as though the net had closed entirely. But Holmes, scanning the room, remained unsatisfied. He seized a lamp from the mantel and held it aloft, casting its light across the walls. Upon the far blind he revealed yet another shadow, tall, stooped, moving even as we stood still. For an instant my blood ran cold. Holmes lowered the lamp. "Do you see, Watson? The second shadow lives still. Even here, in the stronghold of their conspiracy, they prepare their deceptions. Grellan was their artisan, but the design outlives him. We must strip every curtain, tear every blind, before we can say the light has conquered." And with those words the room filled with the tumult of arrests, the scratching of pens as papers were seized, and the indignant protests of men unmasked at last. Yet I knew from Holmes's expression that the case of the second shadow had not yet yielded its deepest darkness. The raid upon the Pall Mall townhouse yielded more than Lestrade had dreamed, yet Holmes remained curiously unsatisfied, while the inspector exulted in the capture of papers and persons alike. Holmes examined the room with that restless scrutiny which marked the true hunter. His eyes ranged over the disordered table, lingered upon the hearth where scraps of charred parchment smouldered, and at last fixed upon a cabinet in the corner. With a swift motion he opened it, revealing a compartment cleverly hidden behind a false panel. Within lay a set of narrow ledgers, smaller than the one recovered from Littleton's safe, their bindings worn by frequent use. Holmes' long fingers caressed them as a violinist as a favourite instrument. "Here, Watson, is the deeper vein," he murmured. "These books are not for mere record, but for concealment. Observe the codes, names replaced by initials, figures disguised in foreign currencies. This is no petty swindle, but an enterprise that stretches across borders. Littleton must have stumbled upon its pattern and realized that a man in his position could not be silent without becoming complicit. His attempt to write the words "the second account" was an effort to warn posterity. For that he was silenced. Sir Reginald Colburn, standing under Lestrade's watchful guard, preserved his composure with icy disdain. "This is preposterous," he declared. "I shall answer to my peers, not to the meddling of a consulting charlatan." Holmes's gaze cut through him like a scalpel. "You will answer to the facts, Sir Reginald, and to the figures in these books. I know enough of finance to trace the flow of money through shadowed channels. It ends in ventures too unsavoury for even the Alabaster Club to parade openly. You cloak them in secrecy, but shadows betray as much as they hide." The men were carried off under heavy guard, though Crenshaw fought like a trapped animal, and Vanier whimpered his protests. Holmes insisted on accompanying Lestrade to Scotland Yard, where the documents were secured in the evidence room. He remained there until dawn, examining every column of figures, his eyes alight with a grim fascination. I confess my own head swam before the maze of symbols and numerals, but Holmes traced them with ease, noting patterns invisible to me. By mid-morning he pushed back his chair with a decisive motion. "Watson, the picture is clear. These payments connect not only to gambling debts and usurious loans, but to shipments along the river, vessels whose cargoes are never entered in any manifest. Smuggling on a grand scale, laced with bribery and intimidation. The Alabaster Club was but the meeting-house for men of wealth who cloaked their villainy in respectability. Littleton discovered their duplicity and, perhaps from some belated moral scruple, resolved to expose them." He began his confession, but Grellan's shadow fell across his page. Lestrade, flushed with triumph, entered just then to report that Grellan had at last spoken. "He will not confess to the murder," the inspector said, "but he admits to being hired by Vanier to contrive the shadow play. He boasts of his craft as though it were an art, not a crime. The rest he denies." Holmes's lips tightened. "Naturally, he is an artisan of deception. Truth is no part of his stock. Still, his admission is enough to fix him to the scene. With the lantern, the ledger, and the testimony of your constable, the case is secure. Yet mark me, Lestrade, Grellan is but the mask, not the face. Sir Reginald is the true culprit, and without him the others would have scattered like leaves." That afternoon, Holmes and I returned at last to Baker Street. He was weary, yet restless still, pacing from hearth to window with the air of a man whose mind had not yet laid its burden down. At length he turned to me. "Do you not see, Watson, how perilously near we came to failing? Had not that constable remarked upon the second shadow, we might have accepted the scene at Cardigan Street as an insoluble locked-room mystery. Grellan's device would have passed unremarked, and the greater conspiracy would have prospered unchecked. It was a trifle that saved us, yet trifles, as I have often told you, are the hinges of destiny." I could not but agree, though I remarked that justice, for once, seemed to have triumphed with rare completeness. Holmes, however, shook his head. "Do not mistake exposure for destruction. The Alabaster Club will close its doors, but men of its stripe will gather elsewhere under another name. Shadows are eternal, Watson. What we do is to thrust a lamp against them for a moment, and in that moment some truth is revealed." The following day brought confirmation of his words. Newspapers trumpeted the scandal, naming Colburn with caution, but hinting at revelations to come. Yet Holmes, instead of triumphing in the publicity, grew more withdrawn. He spent the morning with his violin and the afternoon bent over chemical experiments, as though impatient to thrust aside the case he had so brilliantly unravelled. Only once did he speak of it again. "Do you know, Watson?" he said quietly, as dusk settled over Baker Street. "When I looked upon that blind in Pall Mall and saw the second shadow flit across it, I felt for a moment the same sensation as when one stares into a mirror and perceives a movement that is not one's own. There is something profoundly unsettling in a deception that mimics truth so closely. It is as though the world itself has acquired a double, a darker reflection walking always beside us. That was Grellan's genius, and it is why his trick haunts me still." I could find no answer to this sombre reflection, and so we sat in silence, the firelight throwing our own shadows upon the wall. They moved in perfect accord with us, innocent, unbroken. Yet I understood then that for Holmes the case of the second shadow would linger long after the courts had done their work, a reminder that crime, like shadow, may be cast away by light for a time, but never wholly destroyed. The days following the exposure of the Alabaster Club brought no easing of tension. Lestrade was daily in the papers, hailed as the man who had unmasked a financial cabal of unprecedented reach. Yet in private he admitted freely that Holmes had supplied the key. Despite the public clamour, Holmes himself seemed only half satisfied. He had given his testimony, provided the Yard with irrefutable evidence, and ensured that Colburn, Crenshaw, Vanier, and Grellan would stand before a judge. But he paced the sitting-room with that restless energy which told me the conclusion, though sufficient for the law, was not sufficient for his mind. On the third evening, as I tried to draw him into a quiet game of cards, he suddenly tossed aside his hand with impatience. "Watson," he said, "there is one piece still wanting. We have accounted for the second shadow and for the men who contrived it, but we have not explained why Littleton wrote his message when he did. He had known of the danger for weeks, yet it was only at that fatal moment he seized his pen. What spurred him then?" I ventured that perhaps his conscience had grown too heavy. Holmes shook his head. "No, there was an immediate cause. He had just received some document or communication, I am convinced, and that is why he began his confession. Something arrived that evening, and it is missing still." The next morning he acted upon this conviction. At Cardigan Street he questioned the housekeeper anew. After much hesitation, she admitted that on the night of her master's death a letter had indeed been delivered by hand shortly before 10 o'clock. She had placed it on the salver. When next she looked, it was gone. Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden fire. "Watson, do you see? That letter was the spark. In it lay the confirmation or threat that drove Littleton to his desk. We must trace it." By afternoon he had accomplished what seemed impossible. Through patient inquiry at the local post office and by discreet questioning of a boy who remembered delivering a sealed envelope to number 14, Holmes obtained a crucial detail. The messenger had been paid by a gentleman waiting at the corner, tall and stooped, wearing the same long ulster described by Sykes weeks earlier. It was Grellan. Holmes clenched his fists. Then the letter was bait. They forced Littleton to reveal in writing that he had a second account. He began it, and at that moment the trap was sprung. The very man who signalled with shadows placed in his victim's hand the goad that drove him to betray his knowledge. This revelation seemed to complete the chain. Yet that night Holmes appeared graver still. He sat before the fire, his violin silent in the corner, and spoke with unusual intensity. "You perceive, Watson, the deeper cruelty of the design." It was not enough to silence him. They compelled him to record with his own hand the admission that would damn him if ever discovered. A banker who kept 2 sets of books could not hope for pity. Even in death they sought to stain his name. That, to me, is the most devilish stroke of all. The trial, when it came, was a spectacle. Crowds gathered before the court, eager to glimpse the once respected Colburn and the infamous Grellan. Holmes testified with precision, explaining the lantern, the wax fragments, the distances measured across Cardigan Street. The constable repeated his account of the twin shadows. The ledger and the seized papers spoke with their own damning eloquence. Grellan sat with folded arms and a sneer upon his lips. Crenshaw scowled defiantly. Vanier trembled like a reed. Sir Reginald alone retained a mask of icy disdain. When the verdict was delivered, guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and the murder of Ambrose Littleton, the courtroom erupted. The law had at last cast its light upon the shadows. Grellan was sentenced to death, the others to long years of imprisonment. Colburn, disgraced beyond redemption, heard his sentence with an inclination of the head, as though accepting the inevitable toll of some hazardous investment. In the cab returning to Baker Street, I expected Holmes to display satisfaction. Instead, he gazed out into the fog-dimmed streets with an expression I could not read. At length he said, "Justice has been served, yet the lesson remains. Shadows, Watson, shadows are the true adversaries. They are cast not only by lanterns, but by ambition, greed, and fear. For every Grellan who wields a lamp, there is a Colburn who supplies the darkness into which it falls. We have beaten them here, but only here." I sought to rally him, reminding him that one cannot wage war upon shadows themselves. He gave a weary smile. "No, but one can hold the lamp a little higher. That is all I do, and all I shall ever do." That night, as I set down my notes, I found myself recalling the constable's astonished words. There were 2 shadows. How a trifle such as that had opened the path to a conspiracy stretching across London. It reminded me anew of Holmes's maxim that the smallest detail, properly observed, may unlock the greatest mystery. When I looked up, Holmes was at the window, his lean figure silhouetted against the street lamps outside. The fire flickered, and upon the wall behind him his own shadow stretched, solitary and faithful. For once it had no twin, no sinister companion. And yet I thought I saw in Holmes's eyes that same haunted gleam, as though he would never wholly banish from his mind the vision of a second shadow flitting across a blind in Belgravia, a symbol of crime's duplicity and of his ceaseless struggle to unmask it. In the quiet weeks that followed the trial, the clamour of the city turned to other scandals, and the names of Colburn, Grellan, Crenshaw, and Vanier slipped from the headlines to the footnotes of memory. Yet for Holmes the case of the second shadow lingered as a kind of after-image, like the glow that remains upon the eye after staring too long at a flame. He spoke of it rarely, but when he did it was with a tone curiously different from his usual detached triumph. One evening, as we sat before the fire, I dared to press him on this. "Surely, Holmes," I said, "this was among your most brilliant victories. You untangled a conspiracy that stretched its fingers into the very heart of finance, and unmasked a trick so subtle that any ordinary mind would have dismissed it as fancy. Why? Do you seem so little content with it?" He leaned back, steepling his fingers, his gaze lost in the smoke. Because, Watson, what we destroyed was but one lantern among many. Shadows will always return. They may be cast by greed, by deceit, or by fear. It matters little what fuel feeds the flame. Grellan was but an artisan of false silhouettes, Colburn a man of wealth, cloaked in honour, each one replaceable. What chills me is not their villainy, but the elegance of their device. That a mere manipulation of light could so deceive the eye speaks of how easily the human mind accepts the counterfeit as truth. I protested that justice had prevailed, and that surely was enough. Holmes smiled faintly. For the law, perhaps. But for me, the fascination lies not in the punishment of men, but in the pursuit of understanding. The locked door, the vanished assailant, the second shadow, these were riddles, and riddles once solved lose their sting. Yet I confess, Watson, this case left me with a peculiar unease. I cannot help but feel that I too was, for a time, deceived by a shadow. That is a humbling thought. He rose then, pacing with that restless stride of his. Still we have done our part. A man who sought to unburden his conscience has not died in vain. Littleton's last words, incomplete as they were, guided us to the truth. It was his courage to take up the pen that set in motion the chain of discovery. I find in that a measure of satisfaction. As he spoke, the lamplight cast his tall figure upon the wall, a solitary silhouette against the glow. I watched it as one might watch the fading of a storm, grateful for calm, yet aware that darkness always waits at the horizon. Holmes paused at the window, looking out upon Baker Street, where the fog swirled once more beneath the lamps. "Do you see, Watson?" he said quietly. "The shadows walk with us still, but so long as there is one willing to hold a lamp against them, however small, they shall not wholly prevail." With that he turned away, dismissing the matter as was his wont, and reached for his violin. The first strains of a melancholy air drifted through the room, mingling with the crackle of the fire. And though the case of the second shadow was closed by the world's reckoning, I knew that for Holmes it would remain always a reminder that crime, like shadow, is never absent, but only awaiting the next lamp to reveal it.